So let's review some background information about floating and positioning as we move into this very important topic. Floating and positioning are ways we break out of the HTML flow. To some degree we break out. Floating doesn't so much break out of the flow as move elements to the far left or right. But just imagine, back up for a moment, to this point, everything we've had, every block element, every heading, paragraph, image, another heading, more paragraphs, paragraphs, list, whatever. It's just one thing on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. It's all just stacked. It all just goes in this flow, which is just the order of the things in the document, right? When you float things, you take it slightly out of that flow, you move it to the far left or right to allow the text and the containing element to flow around it. It's really still in the same position in a way, but just the text flows around it, right? But in positioning, we move the element to an established grid position in the browser window. We take it completely out of the flow. We can move it around anywhere on the screen. Imagining a grid, like an XY grid. There's more to it, of course, to positioning. It's like, where does that grid start? What's it in relationship to? That's another issue too. To float something, we just tell it to float in the CSS. If you only had one image on the page, you could use IMG. In my example I already showed you before, though, I gave the IMG an ID, which is more likely what you would do, right? We might give it some margins also, but probably not all the margins would be the same, because we don't necessarily want some text to be pushed away as much as other text, right? Certainly the text to the side where it's touching the text, though, you want to push it away. So that would be an image. But if we're going to, in this exercise, you're going to float some text, that's different. Now, images by their nature have size, right? Text does not. So if you want to float text, you have to give it size. And you probably want to do some other things to it, which we will also, similar to this example here, the thing with an ID of contact, we're going to tell it to float. First give it width, then tell it to float, and then give it some background color, some padding, some margin to try to make it stand out a little bit also. But that's the key idea, is that text needs size to float. And actually to position too, I believe, yeah. Floating block elements into columns. To float block elements into columns, we've been thinking about floating an image into text, but what if you have bunches of text and you want to float those things, like make them into multiple columns? Well, you can float them side by side each other, right? And then you can add margin to push them around. You can float one, add a wide margin, wraps around it, float both of them to the left or the right, float one to the left, one to the right. You can try these different things and see how they work. You have to calculate the width carefully, though, or you may have to have a float drop. A float drop is the idea that you have things you want to float together side by side, but there isn't enough room for them, right? So comes back to the box model and be able to calculate the size of the thing. So if it's not just a simple content area you're floating something that's inside. You've given the box a frame, or like you made the box show up, and you've given it padding also. You have to know the size and the space that you have to deal with too. And this also, if you're using hard units, then you have the issue of how flexible they are. You may use percentages that might change things for you and make it a little easier to handle, perhaps. But you have to make sure your percentages then didn't add up more than 100% of what the original was, right? Clears. Another part of floating is the idea of a clear. When you've told some things to float, you will eventually probably come to something you don't want to float anymore. In other words, you have floated a bunch of images, but now you have some text you want to go back into being a regular paragraph or heading or something, right? Well, the element that begins the normal flow again, we tell it to clear. And clear is just another command. It works the same kind of way that float does. We just tell it to clear. We could tell things to clear left, clear right, or clear both. Clear left means clear left floats. Clear right means clear right floats, and clear both means clear everything. And we tend to use clear both, because usually we just want it to clear. One other issue, we talked about floats that drop. Well, you can also have a container that collapses. Okay? This is a containing float problem or a collapsing container problem. You can look at it either way. Sometimes everything inside a container, which might be a div, for instance, you might put a whole bunch of stuff inside the div, everything inside of it might float. For instance, if that div contains your navigation and you're using floating to set your navigation up, well then everything inside that div is going to float. Think about when everything inside a container floats, the problem is that the container is not held open. Now, that might not be a problem because maybe you don't care. Maybe you're not using that container. You may be just using it to contain the things, but that's okay. You really only care about the things. But if you want to use that container to carry color or a border for you, right? See page 398 for a clear fix solution, which is and another option you can do. Okay. Flow root may be a future option, but it's only experimental now. You want to use the clear fix solution. And we'll run into that in the future. Actually, in this exercise, I think I'll be able to demonstrate it for you. CSS shapes. Oh, wow, this is getting more advanced. You can change the way text flows around something with a CSS shape. You can choose a shape such as a circle, ellipses, or the URL of an image with a transparent background. These features aren't supported by all browsers yet. This is kind of a new area, CSS shapes. But good to know that it's there, and maybe you want to go read about it and even practice with it. By the way, if you ever want to do more advanced stuff, there will be some examples this week that we haven't really done, and you want to show me that you've done it, I would consider it for extra credit if it's something you're interested in. Positioning. One last thing, there's a lot of stuff like that in our textbook that we don't go into detail on. Positioning. You're reading your text about different kinds of position. There are multiple kinds of position, like relative position, for instance. You're most likely, though, to be using absolute position. That sets up a grid of measurements from the top and from the left for an element to be placed. This takes the element completely out of the HTML flow. Absolute positioning, this is how it works. This is how we're going to do it. And this is very similar to the code we will be using in this exercise. You could have a piece of text that looks like this, and then we could use something hashtag warning that matches that ID. We could give it width because it's text. It needs to have width if it's not an image, right? You could give it padding and so on and so forth. And then we could say position absolute, top and left. That means from the top, come down 300 pixels, and from the left, go over 800 pixels. And you could use other types of units in there too. So it's as if a grid is created. The whole thing about absolute positioning, though, is the containing block. If you don't name a containing block, it says it's for the whole. It's X and Y. These top and left refer to the entire page. But what if you want to position it on a particular item? You have to make that a containing block. This is the more on positioning that I'm mentioning, containing blocks. To use positioning well, you may want to study those pages. You also need to understand containing blocks, which means you have to set a container to have the position of relative if you want it to be a containing block, rather than default, which is the viewport, which is the entire window, the entire browser window. I know this is getting a little bit abstract. It'll make a little more sense in the exercise. And this idea of understanding positioning more and doing something more with it is something that you can do for extra credit on this exercise that we have coming up on floating. Float, positioning, and layout. Floating and sometimes positioning are used to be how we did layout all the time. Okay, and it was how we always did setting multiple columns too. When I say used to be, I mean just a couple of years ago, even just a year and a half ago, perhaps. I mean, a long time ago, we used tables for this stuff. That's really outdated. Now, floating is not outdated yet, right? But there is some new ways to do these things too. There's 3 modern CSS modules that are kind of taking over. Flexbox, for sure, is actively being used a lot, and it's very useful. CSS Grid and CSS multi-columns are perhaps a little bit more on the experimental side. I'm not sure if every browser, probably Most all the new browsers do handle them, but there may be some that are just a little bit older that don't. We're going to use Flexbox, and I'm asking you to read about the others. In fact, you can do extra credit with the others if you wish. Z-index. This gets thrown in here just because I suppose there's not someplace else really to put it. We won't have to worry about Z-index too much in these kinds of exercises, but you're going to do a big Dreamweaver tutorial, which is a more advanced page, and a page with a lot of divs on it. And some of them are overlapping. And that's the kind of page where you need to use Z-index, or you might need to use Z-index. Z-index has to do with stacking and layering order. So when you have multiple divs and other elements laying on top of each other, perhaps, you might need to tell a certain one to be on the top. Why? Because maybe it contains something that's a link, like navigation or something. You need to be able to click on it. Whenever you go try to click on something, but there's nothing working, it doesn't work. It's as if there was a transparent shield around it. The fact is that some other layer has come on top of it. And we use Z-index to give the layer to push layers around. Either push a layer behind, or more likely to take a layer that we want and give it a number, and most any number works when we only have one thing getting in a Z-index, and the number puts it up on top of the other things. You can read about Z-index yourself. Okay, so that's the overall demo, the overall information about floating and positioning. Now let's do some with your exercise. Here's the handout for the floating and positioning exercise, which you should have out and handy as we're working through this. I'm going to run through this. This is going to be an example of an exercise that I'm pretty much doing it. You're doing it with me, so I would suggest you just pause the video as I go along, do the typing, make it work, troubleshoot it, and just practice it like that. And hopefully then you'll go on to practice some more on your own too. I would suggest, as it says here, that you make a project folder, name something like float or float exercise, make a root folder, float in your name, download into this root folder from Moodle 2 files, float exercise, and then there's something called JOU317Web. That's an image. So those are the two things you're going to have in your root folder. Of course, I want you to change that float exercise to include your name, and then I want you to open up in a code editor, and let me show you what it's gonna look like. Let's take a look at it. I have it here. Here it is, and I'm going to run it. And you'll see it's a version of this file that I've been using over and over again, right? But it's different a little bit. It's got like these two chunks of links on here. What are these? Well, you'll probably recognize these as navigation, right? This is how navigation starts, as a list of links. And floating is sometimes used as navigation. So therefore, I'm going to show you a little bit of this now, but there will be another navigation demonstration later. You aren't required to put navigation into your resume yet, but you will be in your in the resume final stage. So navigation is going to be something you're going to have to deal with. Some navigation in the top of every page. Then you'll see we have this chunk of stuff called contact. You can imagine that doesn't really belong there like that. Then we'll say we have something here called paragraph left and paragraph right. Okay. Okay, good. But obviously they aren't left and right yet, so we're going to have to do something with that. We have something here called a footer, as if it's the bottom of the page. Something's going to happen with that. We have something here called a warning. This obviously doesn't belong here. Okay, good. And there's something here called a paragraph left flex and paragraph right flex, which of course are not flexing at all yet, so we're going to be doing that. So that's the stuff we're going to deal with. So let's go back to the HTML and the CSS and see you have all this stuff here. You see something floating positioning begins here, flex columns begin here, and navigation stuff is below here, and more navigation stuff below here. Okay, good. Okay, so let's go ahead and we want to put, it says back in the, yes, I'm looking at the instructions, sorry. Place an image after the first paragraph in the div ID main. Okay. Here we are. And I have already made a span here. And it suggests that this may already be made for you, and it is. And we want to put the image in here. Okay, right? So this span is been given an ID. and we're going to put the image in there. Do you remember what the image was called? Well, IMG. Remember how to make images, right? SRC equals quotation marks, and it should have alt text equal quotation marks. And we're going to say it suggests it's jack down, so let's put down jack downs. And then the SRC is going to be jack-600, I think it was, .jpg, right? Okay, let's see and run that. And there's an image. Oh no! Yes, maybe not an image of me, but you never know. Have you really seen me? Anyway, so we've got an image in there. And this just is reinforcing the fact that at this point, when we put an image someplace, it just goes with the HTML flow and it just stacks on top of other things, right? Not probably the kind of display we want. There's nothing wrong with having a big image be floating. By the way, I made my page bigger than it's supposed to be. Let me put it back to its normal size. That's the normal size. Have a big image, probably even bigger than this, not floating at all, but just sitting on top of a heading and maybe centered on the page or something like that. It's okay to have large images actually break the HTML flow, go through the flow in between paragraphs and headings and so on, and just sit there with a caption, probably, right? But frequently, that's not what we want. Frequently, we want text to flow around it, as we do in this example here. Okay, so what are we going to do and how are we going to do that? Very easily, this is floating. So we're going to go up to the float area, way up here. Here it is. So we have the thing called hashtag jack, right? And we're going to tell it to go ahead and float. Let's tell it to first float left. Tap that out a little bit. Oops, lowercase. Float left. Save it and run it. And it floated left. That's fine. Good. Now you can imagine, and you can see that the text is flowing around it. It's somewhat awkwardly because it's almost like it's touching it because we've got no margins or anything. And this image would, of course, need a caption also. So let's go ahead and make it float right, and we're going to add some margins to it also, okay? Excuse my rustling papers as I do this. I'm trying to remember what it is I'm doing here. Yeah, okay, float right. You can imagine what happens with that. And let's go ahead and also tell it to have a margin. I'm going to do margin like this. I'm going to do 0 top, 0 tr right, because it's going to the right, okay? But then I want 2em, which is the bottom, and 2em, which is the left, okay? And we're going to give it a width. Well, actually, we won't worry about that yet. Let's go ahead and just stop there. So we're going to save this. Okay, so you see how adding that margin on the bottom and the left to a right floated thing is very nice. It gives us a little extra space around it and so on. But what if we want to have some text in here, right? A caption. How is that going to work? Well, let's go down to the HTML because we have to add the text in. And text, of course, goes in HTML. And here we are within this span here, right? Whoops, come on. Okay. So within this span, actually, we're not with it. Yeah. Well, let's just for now imagine that it's going to go after the span. And we're going to put the text in. It's going to say, put some blank lines in there. Put the text in that says something like, Jack Dunn's a bad hair day. Wow. Looks like he needs some dental work. Okay. Of course, this isn't going to work, right? I mean, it's going to work in a way, but if I run it, the problem is this text just ends up being up here at the start of the paragraph, right? Because we didn't tell it to be with the span, okay? So we need to take this text and put it inside the span. So it can all be floated with that at the same time. But because, and let's save it and run it. Now what's the problem? It's pushing out beyond the thing, right? It's pushing out beyond the thing, and it's not properly floating. Well, remember I said text needs size to float, right? Also, it needs to match the size of the photo. It needs to know the size too, because we only want to sit underneath the photo, not go beyond the photo. So those are the two things that are operating here. So what's the size it's going to need? Where are we? Go back up again. Here we are. Okay, that photo is 600 pixels wide. I just know that, or you could figure it out yourself. And that's what, because I named it with 600, right? So we're going to say width 600. And let's go ahead and we're going to style. It's nice to style caption text a little differently. So I'm going to say font, weight, make it bold, and font size maybe a little bigger. These are all things you could consider doing with captions. Maybe a little bigger, maybe bolder, maybe bold. 0.2 EM, and then I'm going to say line height. Line height is probably going to be less. I'll make it 1.2, which is just a little bit more than no line height at all, practically. Because it's holding together underneath that image is the idea, right? Let's run that. Okay, so there we are. And maybe you don't like the bolding or something else, and the styling you can go ahead and change as you like, but that is the idea of how we float text and image. Now let's go on to this contact information. See this contact information that's over here? Let's take a look at it back down in the document, and you will see, if I'm trying to remember, yes, I put this in a span. It's called contact. And I actually made some BRs in it because I wanted it to break at certain points, although it feels like it belongs to be the same line. Okay, so this is contact information, and we'll go back up to the floating area. Here are we? Contact, here it is. Okay, do you remember that to make text float, we're going to tell this stuff to float left. But of course, if we just did that, it wouldn't work. We're going to need to have some size. Let's make it 200 pixels. So it wouldn't have floated at all, because it's just plain text without a size. And it will float now, but we're going to do some more things to make it stand out. So it is floating now. It's sort of set off a little bit, but it's still really hard to read. And this is where, if you float some text like in a box, like maybe we really will float your contact information as opposed to just putting it on the bottom of the page when you later on as you move on to the final stage of the resume, for instance. Well, you need to stand out a little bit, right? So let's tell it to have a padding, the space in between the border and the content area of, let's see how much, 1 EM. And we can tell the background color, make it stand out. We'll just use the word white might as well. And then margin, very similar to what we did before. It's 2 EM, 2 EM, 2 EM, and 0. Because it's floating left, the TRBL, the left side will have a 0, but the others will have size, and you'll see how this works out. And let's go ahead and run it. Okay, and there we go. We've got a nice little bunch of text there, which is floated. I have to pause for just a moment, excuse me. Okay, now we're going to get down into the, let me put on my page, into the columns, making columns. So we've got these two chunks of text down here. Where? Down here, called paragraph left and paragraph right. All right. Otherwise, it's just headings and paragraphs in there. And these can have little divs around them, which is the kind of way we would handle this sort of thing. We could call them sections or something else too. There's some newer HTML categories we could use, but this is fine. we're going to move these to left and right. So the number of ways we can do this. I suggest you float both to the left, but that doesn't. But we'll see. You will know why that won't work, right? Probably. Are you imagining if we just float and we don't do something else to it? We have the left and the right. So let's go ahead and tell them both to float left. When you float two things, oops, and that is supposed to be a semicolon. Wow. Okay, when you float two things beside each other, two things that have a certain size, they will move up beside each other. But of course, here's the problem. Nothing's really happened here. They're still sitting here. Something weird has happened, though. The stuff from the footer is floated up in here. A few things going on here. These didn't float yet because they're text, and we didn't give them size. To float, text needs size, right? And then let's look at that first. So what is the size we're going to give them? Let's tell them each to be, well, we could give them hard numbers, okay? But better than that, let's think about using percentages. First, let's see. Well, we can do our overall page. If we do hard numbers, let me show you what happens. Let's make this one probably 300. It's 400 px. And we'll make the next one 400 px. Save it and run it. Okay, so they did move beside each other, but the thing is, this footer thing has come up here too. What's going on? Okay. All right. Here's the problem. The footer, we don't want it to float, so we're gonna have to tell it to clear. And the other issue is, if we use hard units here, if I make my page, well, let's first get rid of the clear. And maybe I should make those bigger than 400 here. So hold on just a second. Let me just, so here we go. We got this footer here, right? It's got background color and stuff. But we don't want it to, we want it to not float. And we have two things before that, just before that are floating up side by side. So we have to tell this to clear. And we could tell it clear left, that would work. But we could just call it clear all. There's no reason not to say clear all in most cases. All right. And I just want to check on my body and be reminded that I have a, yeah, I don't have a hard size entered here. So let's go up in the number in my example to, let's say, 600. And let's save this and run it. Okay, the footer clear is still not working properly because there's too much space there, I think. But we'll look at that in just a second. I may have mistyped that, but we do see the paragraph stuff's floating better side by side. And the footer is to clear all. That should be okay. Hold on just a moment. I know I screwed something up here with this footer. It's clear both. Our choices are supposed to be left, right, or both, not all. So that would work there. And I'm going to run it. Okay. Yeah. So the footer is returned to its normal place, and our paragraphs are here fine. And obviously with margin, we could put some space in between these, right? I could go to this left one and give it some margin right, push that over a little bit. That'd be very nice. But the problem is when a page gets narrower, we have a float drop. The things return are no longer floating, right? So what we really want to do is float columns based on percentages. Use percents for the sizes. That's what we really want to do. So we're going to do, instead of widths there, we're going to try 47%. How about that? 47% and a width of 47%. Okay. And with on the left one, we're going to give it some margin right. And since we're doing percents, we might as do 5%. And as long as 47 plus 47 plus 5 don't add up to more than 100, we're okay. but they do. Oops, I now screwed something else up. 47%, 47%. Sorry for all my mistyping today. I'm obviously not with it. Okay. Yes, I'm afraid I really am not with it. I'm actually didn't realize I hadn't actually saved my page. So this is correct. We float one to the left, 47% width. Float the next one to the left, 47% width. So they'll float side by side. Okay. We'll put a little right margin on this one. And then the thing that follows has clear both or clear left, but doing the same thing. And the way it looks is a paragraph left, a paragraph right. Okay. And the footer is correct. Okay. Now we're going to go on to absolute positioning. So we have this paragraph of text here called warning. We want to stick it on top of this image. Okay, so that's definitely out of the flow, right? So we're going to go down here to find the warning, and the thing has an ID of warning. It's way down here. There, it's called paragraph with an ID of warning. There it is. So we'll go up to, we're still in the floating positioning area, right? Hashtag warning. Here we are. Okay, so what we want to do with this is tell it to absolutely position. And it's just plain text. So as we said before, if you float or position something, that's text, it has to have width. Let's give it 200 pixels. Okay, and we're padding of 1 EM. I think one of the most common reasons a common reason you might do this sort of thing would be you are, excuse me, just want to check, make sure I'm still recording. Yes, I am. Is that you are going to stick like a sticker or something that says like new or sale or something on like the corner of somewhere and just have it sit there. All right. Maybe not this example exactly. And we'll see the problem this example has in a minute. So we're making some little normal styling kinds of decisions here. We're going to tell it to have a color of red, which makes sense for a warning, I think, for the text, and a background color. Still of white will make it stand out. Okay, that's all fine, but now we need to tell it to go, to move. So we tell it to position. What kind of position? Absolute. Now that by itself doesn't do anything. We still had to give it some numbers. So we'll say from top, 500 pixels, and then from left, we'll say, what? I don't know. This is going to be a process of trial and error to come up get these numbers right, because your screen size is different than mine, and my magnification may be different, and things like that. So your numbers are going to be different. Let's see what happens with my numbers. Okay, my numbers worked out very nicely, all right, but here's the problem, all right. If I make this page smaller, let's not make it that much smaller, a little bit smaller, see what's happening? Everything is moving fine except for this. It's absolutely positioned from here. But what I'd like to have happen is have it absolutely positioned based on this position here, okay? For our exercise here, just do some absolute positioning and get it roughly on top of his head, and that's fine. And if it's not, when I look at it, if it's not perfectly on his head, don't worry about it, okay? But if you want to do the extra credit, which we'll see later, you have to figure out how to make that really work. Okay, so that's absolute position though, and the idea of moving something around on the page with it. All right, now we're going to do flex columns, and then we're going to look at the navigation that I already have set up for you. So we're getting towards the end, but this is taking a while, I know, but please stick with me. We have these two paragraphs down here, which we're going to do flexing on. Now, I haven't described, you may have read about, and hopefully you read about, but I haven't yet demoed for you the flex, how the flex walk works. But we have a container around those things, and then within there, we have these two items. Those are the two paragraphs. That's typically the idea. You give a div, for instance, some kind of container like a div, and you stick it around there. So the container, we're going to tell it to display flex, because this is one of our first times we use display command, and we have to tell it to flex, and we tell it justify content space between. And you see the same idea that CSS is always one word, or things are hyphenated, is continuing through here, right? And then we tell that each item to have there's only two items, remember, right? We only have a width of 48%. So what's this going to do? This is going to flex. Flex just means they're going to go up together on the same line. And extra space is going to put people between them, which makes sense. It acts like a margin in between, right? And each one is going to be 48%. So the space in between is going to be 4%. And that is all we have to do to make the two things flex. So in some ways, once you learn Flexbox, it's actually a simpler way to move things around, or it can be a little more straightforward. And there we are. They flex just like that. And of course, both like the others, if we make this page narrower, they also squeeze. And that happens automatically with them. Okay? So that's Flexbox for your first look at it, and we'll learn more about it next week. And then the navigation stuff and so on that I have in here. And actually, I did this in opposite order, didn't I? So we're done with the floating positioning. Let's take a look at the navigation. Right now, they're just links, but I want to show you the navigation. You see, actually, what I've done here is I have commented this out. So all you have to do is release the comment there and release the comment here. But you should take a look through here to see what's happening. This is how we do a flex navigation. We tell something to display flex. It's the UL that the stuff's contained in. And we tell all the A's, which are the links inside, to display block and have lots of styling, different styling things. And we give them a focus, and then we give it a here idea. You are here. The idea that one is stuck. This is the page we're at. And then we tell the lists to not have any, the LIs not to have any bullets anymore. So we'll save this and run it. And this is it. The home is already darkened because we're imagining this is the home page. That's an option. It's the what I call the you are here idea. Shows you where you are because that piece of navigation already looks used, kind of. Because remember, in navigation, we don't do the traditional visited state because we always want navigation to be active. And a hover, that's the hover. I have this little switch going on in the hover. And you can look at how the rest of this is styled with the curled edge, the rounded edges and the boxes and everything. Please look through that code because you're going to need this sort of thing in the future. In fact, you may be cribbing code like this from me. All right. And then I've got the next one. So I'm kind of doing it backward. The first one used a little bit more modern idea of flexing. This next one uses floating to do the same sort of thing. It takes a little bit more work to make it work. All right. But all we're doing is very similar. We give and by the way, and I'll show you this in a minute too, this whole thing about the floating and the overflow auto, which actually is the trick I use to hold open containers that would collapse because of the fact that everything inside is floated. And we do float everything in here. We tell everything to float. Where's the floating? Here it is. All the LIs to float. And then we give this the UL some spacing, some styling. We style the links again and give them a hover. Save it and run it. Okay. And there is this somewhat different example. What if you want to have a bar that sits there like that? Whatever, right? And by the way, notice that as a result of the changing space up here, my little label here has slipped down a little bit. That's the issue with how I've absolutely positioned this, right? You will want to fix. I want to show you, this is getting very long, I know, but let me continue. Just one more thing. What if I didn't have this overflow auto here? Let's get rid of that. Save and run it. See, this is what happens when a container is not held open. You see? The container is not held open. It's there. I'm using that container. I have some color on it, but it's not going around the items that are in it because everything inside is floating. But I use this trick, which is tell it to have an overflow of auto, and now it is held open. it actually pushes the stuff around below it also. Okay, and the last thing is in the assignment, if you go through the very end, all the stuff we did, you'll see extra credit. Make a new version of this exercise, diving deeper into absolute positioning, and you have to fix this containing block idea. You're actually going to have to change some HTML, and you're going to have to imagine how a containing block would work, and you have to move some things around a little bit. But you can read about it on those pages. You'll make a new version, new copy of this, and you'll upload this separately. So I would do all this stuff, other stuff first, save it, zip it, stick it on into the Dropbox. Then if you want to continue, work some more, change the name of it, and then you can use the extra credit folder for this.